So again, welcome to this conversation with Ligeia Lugli on computing the Dharma, new tools to explore Buddhist Sanskrit literature. I'm Karin Myers. I'm director of Mangalam Research Center, which is located in Berkeley, California on the lands of the Ohlone people. Before I introduce Ligeia, I'd like to say a little bit about upcoming Mangalam programs. And as I do that, my colleague Tilak will share links for more information on these programs in the chat. So we have, starting at the beginning of September, the first week in September, a program Sanskrit for students of the Buddha Dharma. We also have a classical Tibetan course geared for students of the Buddha Dharma, also beginning the first week in September. And so if you know people who might be interested in those programs, please spread the word. And there are also a limited number of partial and full scholarships available. Another upcoming course is beginning at the end of October on Buddhism in the Imagination, which is related to a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute, which we will be hosting in June at Mangalam Research Center. And it has been postponed 2 times because of COVID, but hopefully 3rd time is the charm. Oh yes, and Tilak will also share a link to our last week's conversation on the importance of chanting in the study of Buddhist Sanskrit with our colleague Mattia Salvini. So I'll say a little bit about the format for this evening. So I'm sorry, morning. We usually do these in the evening for this morning. So Ligeia will be talking for about 30, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And at that point, you can raise your hand and ask a question. That's our preferred mode. But if you prefer to put it in the chat, that is okay as well. I will look at the chat and relay those questions to Ligeia. So now I'd like to introduce this morning's guest. Again, it's Dr. Ligeia Lugli. She is director of the Mangalam Research Center's Buddhist Translation Workbench. She holds a PhD in the study of religion from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And she has participated in a number of digital humanities projects, including an online reference resource for Indian philosophy and digital dictionaries of Buddhist Sanskrit and Tibetan. She'll be visiting professor in applied linguistics at Sao Paulo University in Brazil, starting in December. And Ligeia and her team at Mangalam Research Center have recently been awarded a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for developing an infrastructure for Sanskrit natural language processing. So without any further ado, welcome, Ligeia.
Thank you, Karin, for introducing me and for hosting me. And I am very pleased to see many people I haven't seen in a long time are here attending, and I am very glad to see you all again. So I'm here to share with you a kind of informal progress report on the Buddhist Translator Workbench. Some of you may recall that the Buddhist Translator Workbench began around a decade ago. I myself joined it in exactly, I think, 9 years ago. It was end of July 2012. And the aim of the Buddhist Translator Workbench was, and still is, to create a lexical resource to facilitate the translation of Buddhist Sanskrit text into English. Now, that is still the aim. However, the scope of the project has really vastly expanded since then, especially in the last 5 years since I've become director of the program. So let's start by sharing with you a little bit what we are doing, what we have been doing, and then I will present especially the dictionary. That is our main tool. So at the moment, or in the last 5 years, we have been working on these 6 main outputs. And I have to highlight that they are still all at different stage of development. So they are still very much work in progress. Some are more nearing completions than other, but they are still in development. So please feel free to give us any feedback or feature request. Is the perfect time for us to try and implement it. So the central piece of the program is still the Dictionary of Buddhist Sanskrit, which now is also complemented by a Thesaurus. So it's a dictionary and Thesaurus of Buddhist Sanskrit. Then we have developed a Buddhist Sanskrit segmenter and lemmatizer. If you don't know what segmenter and lemmatizers are, don't worry, I will explain it in a minute. Then we have produced a lemmatized corpus of Buddhist Sanskrit literature. It comprises around 250 texts at the moment for a total of 6 million words, and it keeps expanding. So it will get bigger, although I don't think it will get massively bigger than this, just because of the amount of Sanskrit literature that is available, Buddhist Sanskrit literature that is available, but it is still expanding. Then we have prepared an annotation tool for corpora that we use for Buddhist Sanskrit, but can be used for any corpus. And as Karin mentioned, we just started on a new project which aims at developing a set of NLP tools, especially for automatic or semi-automatic word sense discrimination and synonym detection. So it means that it's a tool that will tell you what probably a word means in a certain context and what are the likely synonym for that word in a text. And then finally, we are working on creating a blueprint for digital dictionary of historical and low resource languages, not just for Buddhist Sanskrit, but virtually any language. And we have developed a lexicographic model that I will introduce in a short while that is mostly based on data visualization. And we have already exploited, as they say in the grant lingo, this particular blueprint for another dictionary, which is a dictionary of Tibetan verb valency. And this dictionary will be released in a few weeks, has been produced at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and it will be hosted by Mangalam. So if you're interested, just stay tuned on the Mangalam Twitter account, and it will be announced when it releases, probably early in September. So you may wonder why we started out with such a neat goal, just creating a lexical resource for Buddhist Sanskrit. So why did we decide to branch out and do all these side projects? And you may be especially puzzled by this decision if you know that our team comprises 3 people. So obviously we are very, very thinly spread in doing all these different projects. However, the reason is very simple. All these different resources we are creating are ultimately serving the purpose of helping us developing our Sanskrit dictionary efficiently. So when I started back at Mangalam, the workflow was entirely manual for creating the dictionary, and it was really not efficient. So there were at least two problems with the manual workflow. So the first one, I think everybody can guess what it is. It's just it's extremely slow. So obviously, if you integrate some form of automation in your workflow, the dictionary is going to progress faster, easy. Now, the more profound reasons where the lack of a computational workflow really impacts the project is that it obfuscates interpretative decisions. So the workflow we had at the beginning, when I say entirely manual, it means that we started by just looking for a word in a bunch of texts, more or less, I mean, with the aid of a computer, but more or less manually because we didn't have a corpus. So we had to do all kinds of searches to just retrieve a word in context. Then we had to read through the citations, analyze them, and then produce some kind of summary of the word, the meaning of the word in context. And then the editorial process would start, and basically the editorial process would repeat most of the steps, and it would again read all the citations, decide what the word means, and then engage in a discussion with the lexicographer who submitted the entry. And often some problems or some conflicts in the interpretation of passages would emerge. And they were very difficult to resolve because ultimately much of this semantic analysis is really interpretive. So that's problematic, and again, it's also very, very slow. So with a computational pipeline, we can really improve this process by making the interpretation more transparent. So ultimately, anybody that has read the Buddhist Sanskrit text would probably agree that most of the time they don't make for an easy read. And there are many, many passages where the same word, the same context can be interpreted differently. It depends on your assumption about the text. It depends on your assumption about the philosophy the text expounds, etc. Or even just what element in the context you foreground in your analysis. So it's inevitable that there is some subjective interpretation involved in the process, and I do believe that is neither desirable nor achievable to try to eliminate this interpretation. However, one thing that is very desirable, especially for lexicographic purposes, is to make the interpretation explicit. Try to link it to the factors that have informed your interpretation as much as possible, and try to use those factors to suggest your line of inquiry and to open the possibility of different interpretations. So to do that with a totally manual workflow is not easy, simply because by the time one has read 100 citations that are all more or less the same, an interpretation has surely formed in the mind of the reader, but the reader is probably not very aware of where exactly the interpretation has formed. And the one or two pieces of information that will stick in their minds are probably the very strange citations that somehow they are salient to attention, and they are not the normal use of the word. So one problem that we found, and I know that is a cognitive bias that affects lexicographers of any language, is that usually the lexicographers were very tempted to select and to base their analysis of examples that were really very, very strange, maybe philosophically interesting or hermeneutically interesting, but not the typical word in context that you want to find in a dictionary. So how to combat this bias, how to try to, if not eliminate it, at least to manage it. So with the computational pipeline with annotation schema that are decided beforehand, the clear guidelines for the annotation, it's possible to really encode in the corpus itself, in the data themselves, the linguistic feature that you encounter, and then it's possible to systematically analyze your own annotation and understand where the interpretation comes from. Now, this is still a subjective process, because obviously when the annotation involves annotating the meaning of the word, is always going to be your interpretation of the meaning of the word. But now you know exactly which passage you are interpreted how, and also you have other annotations that will help you to understand why you annotated it that way. Maybe the connotation was negative, and you can say, well, it was negative because the word is modified by this adjective, or some other, the word is contrasted with this other word that we know as a positive or whatever other connotation. So there are many more information that are readily accessible and readily analyzable. So it was clear to me fairly early on in the project that we really would benefit from integrating more of a computational workflow in our dictionary making process. Then the problem became which workflow to adopt. So there is a trend, there has been for many years now, a trend of increasing automation in the industry of lexicography, so in the industry of dictionary making. So it has become almost commonplace now for dictionary project of mainstream, like contemporary languages, to do very little manual work beforehand. So people would use large amount of pre-processed corpora, so basically machine-readable bodies of text, and then they would extract the information automatically, analyze the information automatically, and from that automatically generate a draft of the dictionary. And then the lexicographer comes in and edits this draft. So this works so well that has been possible, not so recently, like 3 years ago maybe now, to create from scratch a multilingual dictionary for 3 major contemporary languages in only 9 months. Now, to give you a sense of the scale of this, for us back at the beginning of the Buddhist Translator Workbench, in 9 months, if we were very lucky and we all agreed on all the interpretations available, maybe in 9 months we would do 2 words. So from going to 2 words to a full dictionary, obviously it's an enormous jump. So it's clearly very tempting to just say, well, let's adopt this automation workflow and let's have the dictionary done in 9 months and then we all look for a new job. But unfortunately, it doesn't really transfer very well. So these automation pipelines that are used mostly are targeting major contemporary languages. So there are mainly two problems with trying to adapt them to historical low resource languages. Main problem is they require something like hundreds of millions of words of text. Now, we simply don't have hundreds of millions of words in Buddhist Sanskrit. Not to mention that we don't have them in the correct format, but just they are not available ever. The other problem is that these automation pipelines usually do not work well with uncertainty. And when we deal with historical material, and especially with Buddhist Sanskrit, but I would say in any kind of historical material, uncertainty is everywhere. So it's not just a matter of semantic interpretation, it's also how to categorize the text, how to categorize, periodize the text, for example. Is this, I don't know which period this text belong to, or these other texts belong to, or if you want to do some kind of analysis for these specific uses. Obviously, one needs to decide what kind of genre or what kind of text type a certain text belongs to, and that is all very uncertain and very up for discussion. So it's not easy to just take the existing pipelines and adopt them for Buddhist Sanskrit. However, looking at how this computational pipeline work is very informative, because one gets to think of what is automatable and to what extent is automatable, and what do we need for a minimal automation to be possible. So obviously, the first thing one needs is a machine-readable corpus. So basically, in order to do any kind of lexical analysis with a computer, one needs to have the lexical unit available to the computer. So that means that the text need to be lemmatized. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, let's make an example in English, very simple. Let's say you have the word drunk, drink, and drinking. It's possible to lemmatize them all to the verb to drink. So that's fairly easy. It has become really trivial for English natural language processing. Now, with Sanskrit, there is an extra step one needs to do, which is separate the words. So because Sanskrit doesn't usually separate words, or at least it doesn't do it consistently, so words are usually glued together, and it's quite difficult to separate them. So this is why the first kind of side project came about, and I set myself the task of creating a segmenter. So for those of you who are not familiar with Sanskrit, when it's written in the Devanagari script, it looks more or less like this. So you can see there are very long strings before there is any separation. So these strings can be split in multiple ways, which make it even more difficult. So if you have a single very short string like Rupakara, you still have 7 possible ways to split it. So not very easy, especially when then the string gets longer and longer. And when you deal with some Buddhist Sanskrit text, you can get strings that run for a paragraph. So there are other problems too, which is when the word merge, they change, so the characters are actually not all there. And it becomes really painful to decide how to split them. Then in the case, especially Buddhist Sanskrit, there is a lot of spelling variations, some of which is predictable, some of which is not predictable. Also because some is not real spelling variation in the sense, historical, philological sense of spelling variation. Some is just typos that have been added in the process of digitization. And the process of digitization also creates all kinds of idiosyncratic way to represent the text digitally. So some editors decide that they want to replicate the Devanagari script and put everything in one string. Some others decide to put white spaces here and there. So it's all non-consistent. And finally, Buddhist Sanskrit and Sanskrit in general, it's extremely rich morphologically. We have 72 inflectional realization for a single adjective. And also in the case of many Buddhist texts, the morphology is also non-standard. So you cannot just follow a rule, but there are different set of rules that apply and a lot more ambiguity coming about in the same morphological realization. So there were already, when I started out in my search for a segmenter, there were some existing tools. I started this work in late 2016. So basically the tool divided into two main groups, the rule-based segmenters and lemmatizers and the machine learning-based segmenter and lemmatizers. So the rule-based tools at that time, they were a little bit constrictive in the sense that they were expecting perfectly regular grammar and morphology. So that would never work with this kind of material because it's not perfectly regular in any way. So the second type, the machine learning tools are much more flexible. However, they have the drawback that they require a lot of annotated data as training data. So basically the main idea is that if you have 10 million words, and you want to segment them or to process them, you do by hand 1 million, let's say, or I don't know exactly how much. Anyway, you do a substantial part of it, and then hopefully the machine will process the rest automatically. But doing that first bit manually is extremely time consuming, and it also requires a lot of specialized skills. So it's not so easy to just do it. So what we needed was a way to segment irregular Sanskrit without the need of training material. So in the end, I was very lucky. The solution is fairly simple. You can do it with an n-gram based rule-based system. And I have done it quite successfully, and I keep refining my own tool. And once the segmentation is done, from segmentation to lemmatization, it's really not difficult. There are some problems with some verbal forms because the verbal conjugation is a bit crazy in Sanskrit, but we are lucky that in Buddhist texts, there aren't that many verbal forms, so that is also fairly easy. Anyway, if you have questions about the segmentation, etc., I will answer them later on. But what I want to talk about is rather what we did once we had the lemmatized corpus. So at that point, a number of opportunities open up. So finally, we could automate part of the process. So the easiest thing, immediate thing to automate is just to retrieve concordances. So now it's become really trivial to just find all the instances of a word in a text. That now takes a fraction of a second. So it's already very good. Now, once we have all the sentences, now we can also process it in various ways. We can analyze the context automatically. We can derive all kinds of statistical information for it. One application personally that I found quite useful for lexicographic purposes is to, for example, to compare, statistically compare the context of synonyms or near synonyms, so that it can highlight what kind of difference is there in the two synonyms. So to make just an example, we had two words that are very similar, is ruta and gosha. They both mean sound. So we wanted to know whether they just both meant sound, exactly the same, or they were kind of different sounds. So one thing that was picked up by the system is that gosha tends to be a very resonant sound. So it's the sound of drums, of thunder, or the sound of the Dharma being taught. Whereas ruta is more of a melodious sound or a voice, or then obviously the most common application in Buddhist text is also that it just means a word. So that we surely would have reached the same conclusion by reading hundreds of citations eventually, but that was really a matter of a second just to see it as a graph. And then you can check whether it's true or not in the actual citations. So the other thing is, I've also created this annotation tool to allow a more rigorous, systematic way to process this lexicographic data. So now the lexicographers get the citations automatically from the system already sampled, and they read through them and annotate them with a set of informations that we have decided. This information include obviously the meaning that they think the word has in a specific instantiation, as well as relationship like this word is glossed by this other word, or is juxtaposed to this other word, is contrasted with something, and so on. And by the way, we have plans for the future to create a parallel tool that explores this kind of glosses and juxtaposition in a tradition of text. So between a root text and several commentaries to see how the hermeneutics play with the semantics of the text. So once the annotators, the lexicographer, annotate a variety of information in the text, and they are all very useful for lexicographic purposes. But the one thing that I think is especially important in their annotation is that they annotate uncertainty. So instead of just saying, well, this word means this, that's it, they also take into account whether they are sure that the word means that, or whether there are some problems. So that we have a four-fold typology of uncertainty, and they record if they are uncertain because there are philological problems in the text, or if they're uncertain because there are some disputed interpretation, maybe someone has published a translation of the text and they have rendered it very differently, or maybe the context is very vague, or sometimes it's just they are uncertain, we are uncertain, we don't really know what to make of it. So one, I think, of the important contributions that we are making in general to lexicography is the idea that uncertainty needs to be made explicit. We cannot just hide it and pretend that we have the solution or all the meanings of the words. We need to really share with our audiences our uncertainty so that they can make their own mind. The other advantage of having an annotated corpus, a systematically annotated corpus, is that then it becomes really easy to derive an automatic version of the dictionary that simply renders in some kind of interface what we have annotated. So once the information is already encoded, to derive the dictionary from that information becomes rather trivial. There are a number of ways one could derive a dictionary from an annotated corpus. We have opted for a data visualization-based dictionary. And this is mainly for two reasons. First is it doesn't require much editing. It's much easier to render data as data visualization automatically rather than try a text generation template or machine learning-based text generation, which then require a lot of post-editing because there are always some problems in the wording. So in one way, it's technically easy, but also it's rather empowering for the users, we believe, because it's very engaging. All the data visualization are interactive, and people will be able to pursue their own line of inquiry when they use the resource. And especially, we allow users also to come up with their own annotation if they so wish. So, for example, one of the features that we have is to explore different aspects of the lemma in a graph. So, for example, one could see the subsenses plotted against the text type or genre. And the same, they can also plot it against period or many other criteria. However, what if people come up with a different classification of genres? For example, we have literature and stotras as two different categories, and now we can understand that people may want to conflate the two and just have one bucket. So we definitely don't want to trap people in our own categorization. So what we allow to do is to edit our metadata. So people that are unhappy with our categorization can just either use this editor in the interface and just decide to assign a different value to whatever text, or they can just download the table, edit it completely in a different way, and upload it back, and then visualize the metadata that they prefer. Now, if one also wants to really change the semantic categorization, so if one is not happy with the senses we have come up with, but still wants to take advantage of the work we've done or the citations we have retrieved, most of the annotation that we have made, then they can download the dictionary data. It's downloadable at the moment as a CSV file, so then they can edit it and do whatever they want, their own analysis with it. So the main idea is that our dictionary wants to be a research tool and a tool to really aid the translators, so that we are not providing this solution. We're just providing information, and then people can build on that information. Now, one problem, okay, so maybe I could show you, if I have a bit of time, I could show one of the main, I think, advantages of for the sake of translation of this dictionary is the ability to compare different words. So you compare near synonyms and see why are they used similarly or differently. So it's possible to see the semantic categories or semantic fields that they express. Now, I talked about semantic fields a lot in the past, so I will not go into that, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have. But then it's possible also to see, for example, the dispersion or the distribution over the corpus. So sometimes words are very similar, in meaning, but obviously some are much more common than others. And then there is a question of register or frequency that is in place. And then also it's possible to compare, for example, a connotation of the two words or things like that. So this is all hopefully useful and powerful, and there are really many different features. One can look at, for example, contrastive examples to see what an noun is contrasted with, etc. Or one can use the Thesaurus view to compare the examples from one word or the next. In this one, so one can see the different instantiation of the word in context. And there are very many different data visualizations available. However, there is no interpretation of how to read all these data visualizations. There is no guidance as to which data visualization is really providing highlights, because obviously the moment you automate data visualization, you are providing the same chart for every lemma. Now, it's possible that for one lemma, the bar chart of the chart in the senses with the period is really revealing some information. But maybe for the next lemma, what you really want is a different kind of plot. And then you will see something revealed. So this is not feasible with a completely automated system. So what we have done is that we have launched a series of lexical portraits. So at the moment, we only have one lexical portrait available online, which is for the word vitarka. But there will be more following the future. And here the idea is that we have our own narrative that is completely manually written and is accompanied by data visualization that are generated automatically, but then manually edited for maximizing their communication power. So, for example, this chart is charting the frequency of vitarka relative to all the words in our corpus, and especially relative to similar words. So words that also express something similar to vitarka. Now, at the beginning, this chart was really populated with a lot of near synonyms, and that impaired the reading of the chart. So we decided to manually trim it, and now it's much more readable. So this is what I mean why it's manually edited. Then we have an explanation of the frequency of what do we make of this plot and what do we make of, for example, this plot, which is kind of interesting because vitarka is one word that is very uniformly distributed across all periods, which is kind of rare. So here we explain how we interpret this data. And similarly here, we make a point about register. So we try to address issues that could be interesting for translation. So obviously, vitarka has a technical doctrinal meaning and is also really overwhelmingly more frequent in Shastra, so in philosophical treatises. However, this doesn't automatically mean that it's always technical. So here we make a point that there are many cases where it's really has a general language kind of feel. And here we basically explain the chart and our interpretation of it. And similarly with the context, we provide a word cloud. And it's very easy to generate word clouds. However, you can generate different word clouds depending what the parameters are for the word to stand out. So originally, straight out of the box, the word cloud comes with a default parameter of having the keywords that are significantly correlated with the word we are analyzing. Now, when we did that, we ended up with some really obscure Sanskrit words that gave us zero insight into the meaning of vitarka. And the reason for it is just because some really rare words tend to always occur with vitarka. But that was really not informative. What we wanted was something that would bring out the two senses that we have identified. So in order to do that, we had to play a little bit with parameters. And then we saw that if we made it as statistically significant in terms of the distribution across all the text in the corpus, we would get this, which is a much better word cloud, because then here we have kama and vichara coming up. And by the way, these are stems. That's the way why there is no final A. And this is because, as is in the information paragraph explains, we have used a previous version of the corpus, which was only stemmed and not lemmatized. So anyway, we change the parameters so that we create something that has more communicative power, and then we explain the parameters in the information. And it will always be different. So we are going to now, we are working on a new lexical portrait for Prajnapti, and it's going to be different. It's not going to be the same parameters. So we will always specify in the information what parameters we are using. And finally, we have a semantic prosody, so kind of connotation explanation. And here is the only interactive graph we propose in this particular portrait. And then the unpicked examples illustrating the when is a positive connotation, when is a negative connotation, etc. So this is pretty much what we've been up to in the last 10 years. And I think should probably stop talking because I'm sure I'm nearing my allowed slot. However, before I shut up, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that all these resources would not have been made possible without the continuous support of the Mangalam Research Center, and also without the contribution of my colleagues, especially Bruno Galazekal and Luis Quiñones. So thank you.
Thank you, Ligeia. Before we open it up to, I want to have both of us spotlighted. Okay. Before I open it up to questions from the general audience, I'd like to ask one that might be especially on the minds of people just starting out in their study of Sanskrit. And so maybe you could say a little bit about, the deficiencies of the dictionaries that are available that normally studying Sanskrit and you're interested in Buddhism, how are you limited by these resources?
All right. So, well, that very much depends on which languages you feel confident in perusing a dictionary. Obviously, there are very limited resources for English only speakers, but if one sets out to study Sanskrit, probably can also study a bit of German or a little bit of Japanese, and then you're sorted. Now, the problem though is even when you expand your focus to include the resources for Buddhist Sanskrit in any possible language, there is still a big problem, which is they are not corpus based. So, and that's mostly because there was no corpus of Buddhist Sanskrit. So I created the corpus of Buddhist Sanskrit. Now we have it, and now we can play with it. But before that, we simply didn't have it. So there are, let's take an example that probably is the reference, like the classical topical reference for Buddhist Sanskrit is Edgerton Dictionary. So obviously is an invaluable resource, and it is really very good. But Edgerton didn't have a corpus, and he probably knew Sanskrit very well, but still it must have taken some time even to Edgerton to read through a lot of text, because if you look at the sources he only used 49 texts. Now, 49 texts is very small. We are using 250 and still is very small. So it's important to understand that the current resources for Buddhist Sanskrit tend to emphasize the meanings derived from the most well-known texts, especially the texts that were already well-known in the 50s. So obviously a lot of new materials keeps coming up, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important that we create natural language processing resources, because it's it's an historical corpus, but it's a corpus that keeps growing because we keep finding new material. And I'm sure that the time will come when, really a lot of material will become available when China decides to open the gates of their libraries. So we have a lot of Sanskrit texts, Buddhist Sanskrit texts there that is not accessible yet, but we start to have the tools so that when it becomes accessible, we will be able to really easily integrate it in our dictionaries and resources. Yeah.
And my other question was related to just that you mentioned at the end, the natural language processing. of Sanskrit. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit for those of us who the lexicography is a little bit, alien to us. If you could say a little bit about what that involves and how that works together with this project.
So, well, the natural language processing tools that we're going to create for this particular project we just started, they revolve around a technology that is very fashionable at the moment, is word embeddings. So for those of you who are not familiar with word embeddings, it basically means transforming a word in context in a numerical representation. And what is important is this numerical representation allows the computer to compare the context in which words occur. And obviously the computer is very good at comparing numbers. So the moment the strings of words are transformed into numbers, it becomes very easy for the computer to come up with all kinds of comparisons. And there are different ways to do word embeddings. And usually one thing that is one of the facts that are often known about them is that they require a very huge amount of text to work well. So we don't have that huge amount of text. So you may think, why are we going to do word embeddings? So the reason is that nowadays word embeddings have evolved a lot, and it's possible to use transfer learning so that you can use word embeddings trained on a bigger set of data and then adjust it for a domain specific type of data. So for this reason, we are creating also what we call a reference corpus. So it's basically a corpus of general Sanskrit that is not Buddhist. And this obviously simply because there are more general Sanskrit texts than Buddhist Sanskrit texts, so it's possible to have a bigger corpus. Then we train the word embeddings on this bigger corpus, and then we refine them and adjust them to the Sanskrit specific corpus. And this will also allow us to compare, for example, the meaning, how the words are used in Buddhist Sanskrit versus how the words are used in non-Buddhist Sanskrit, and do all kinds of other comparisons. For example, one fun fact. We are trying also to use the reconstructed Sanskrit. So you may be aware of the fact that in Sarnath, they have been producing a lot of retranslation, back translation from Tibetan to Sanskrit, which obviously has some advantages, but many disadvantages. But one thing that we find interesting is to see whether it's going to be possible to then detect automatically that the text has been reconstructed. And I think it will be possible, because I do believe that the retranslation process doesn't work. But we'll see. Maybe I've proven wrong, and then these people will have done an amazing job, really. So that's basically what the tools will be doing for us, and mostly they will also cluster together sentences that occur in similar contexts. So it will be a bit better for us to sample different, because obviously we can't annotate the entire corpus, so we need to sample. And one thing that we want to do is try to sample words that are in very varied contexts. So that will facilitate that, and a number of other things.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to open it up to the audience to raise their hand. I saw William Giddings before you had your hand up. Would you like to ask your question, or was it answered?
Oh, I thought I was clapping.
Sorry.
But I do have a question, and Ligeia, it's wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, wonderful to meet you. Yeah, to see you.
My question, I suppose, really goes back to when we were talking about these things, when you back in 2016, when you were sort of getting the ball rolling on this one. And as you remember, much of my work focuses on Chinese texts, and one of the issues I had with that were diachronic changes in word usage and word meanings. Are you coming across similar issues within the Buddhist corpus of Sanskrit, and how do you handle those?
Well, yeah, I mean, diachrony is very, very difficult in Sanskrit, and much more difficult, I think, than in Chinese. So surely there is going to be some differences. And but one of the things that I'm starting to think about is how to do an historical dictionary that is anachronic, because the diachrony thing is so complicated, because we really don't know the relative chronology of the sources. So what we can do is to provide a diachronic overview based on the dating that people have come up with, but we need to alert the audience that these datings are really extremely tentative. So it might be possible to have an alternative grouping of the sources. I mean, I think this is definitely possible. This is something that I am aiming to have a grouping of the sources that may highlight relationships. So one of these relationships may be these are synchronic. So it is possible that we will see some different aggregation of the texts, respective of what we expect from a diachronic point of view nowadays. However, whether the reason why these texts are similar is periodization or some other factor, that is when it gets tricky, because I don't think we have a way of knowing that. But let's see. I mean, it's going to be fun.
Oh, I was unmuted. Sorry, my typing probably was. So while we're waiting for other questions, I'd like to ask, you had talked about the challenges of segmenting, and then you said you figured it out. But I don't recall you explaining how you figured it out. And I wonder if it—
No, I didn't explain it because I wanted to focus on the dictionary. So I didn't explain it, but it is really very easy. And we've been talking with Will back in 2016. So the main idea was that, so my main problem at the time was that I didn't really know how to tell the computer what to do. So I didn't know how to program a computer. So that was the main obstacle, because the idea of how to do it was very clear in my mind. And the idea is just you do it like a student. So, okay, we all have been teaching Sanskrit, so we know, and also we remember our own struggle. So the main problem when you start out with Sanskrit is that how do you know how to split a string, right? So basically what do? You look for the biggest, longer string that fits, and then you try to piece out the rest together, right? So basically, if you simply order all the possible strings by length, so starting from the longest to the shortest, then you will get your result. So if you want, I can share you the result. So you will have something. You will have something like this. So here you derive all the possible character strings, and I have decided to go from I think 3 characters up to 19 characters. So you divide, you take all possible gibberish, and then you see if it fits. And if it fits in a word list. So all those that actually you can match towards a word list, you save. Then you order them from the longer to the smaller. And then you just basically, yeah, it's really low tech, super low tech. So basically you search and replace, and you replace it with a capital letter. Once it's capital letter, it cannot be searched by the tool anymore. So you go for the next longest one and the next longest one. And in the end, you get this. And the advantage of this is that you can completely ignore the suffixes. So all this non-standard morphology, the non-standard sandhi, this system doesn't care about it. So that's the beauty of it. And once you have it in this format, to go from this to lemmatized is really easy, because basically, most of the time you start an A and it works. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So we still have time for more questions from the audience, and don't be shy, even if it's a very simple question. So Christopher.
You're muted.
I'm muted. Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I liked it. I liked very much seeing what you're doing, and I like your simple solutions approach. I'm wondering, it looks like, to me, it seems like there are a lot of applications here for cross-linguistic things also.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, you can use n-grams the same way on Tibetan text and Chinese text. And I'm wondering if there's some like future plan to link the Sanskrit dictionary terms to Tibetan terms and Chinese terms, and have some like master dictionary of all Buddhism that would be very useful for things like text alignment.
Yes, you're totally right. And text alignment is indeed in the, in the agenda. Although I wasn't thinking so much about Tibetan text alignment, but text alignment with English. So I don't know about, the Ngram applications. I know you worked on it, and you surely made better progress on the Chinese stuff than, my Chinese is very basic. So the thing is, I think I was successful with a very simple approach to Sanskrit because I know Sanskrit fairly well, and I know I could see the problem in simple terms. Now, when it comes to Tibetan or Chinese, my mastery of the language is nowhere near Sanskrit, so it's already a problem. And also, those are more syllabic. So I don't know, maybe the possibilities are too many, especially if I think Tibetan, it looks like the possibility may be too many to be handled by such a simple process. Now, it is true that in some cases for Sanskrit, for Tibetan Buddhist text, I think adding an engram to the existing segmented corpus could be useful, because when I used the corpus, the one that Marieke has segmented, there are many problems in the Buddhist sections because they have reduced it too much. So basically, any of the names of the Bodhisattva, for example, they are parsed into their little components, and then obviously the whole thing is kind of unhelpful. So for those kind of situations, I think an engram approach may actually work. I don't have a plan to do it myself. As I said, my Tibetan, maybe Bruno could jump in, and surely if you want to, to try.
I'm terrible at all of these languages. I just do the computer. I just try to get the computer to do anything I can.
I see. But for the master plan of the dictionary and creating a resource that could link all the languages together, yeah, definitely. So this is one of the application I can see for the project that Tilak is now working on, which is the RDF conversion. So we want to have the dictionary data in a graph form, and then that would obviously facilitate the possibility of then integrating it with existing resources. For example, for Chinese, we could surely integrate it with the SAT database, for example. And possibly Tibetan too. So that is something I'm looking forward to. We are not close to it. We still, some work to do, but I definitely see it as a future implementation.
I really like the way that you describe the messiness and dirtiness of the problem, because I think a lot of people come to this and just think, just run it through the computer and use AI. I
met many of those people. Yes. It's not always easy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So William has another question.
Well, gosh, yes, you mentioned the messiness of it all there, Christopher, but I've got to ask that question, Nigel. You've come so far, you've come so far. You've almost got the Sanskrit Rosetta Stone in your hand.
Yeah.
So this is the big question for you. How far are you away from creating a translation engine from the translation memory that you've accumulated?
I haven't even thought about it. No, I don't know, but it's possible. I'm not sure though. The problem with the translation memory is that now we have a bit of aligned text, right? But the translations are all very different. So I don't think that we have sufficient text to really get there, because now the data sparsity is against us, basically. So I don't see the translation application coming along, but you will do it. I'm sure you will surprise us. Is
it a desirable thing?
Well, that I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I have to admit that sometimes when I feel very lazy and I have a piece of Japanese that I need to read, I just put it in Google Translate, and then I use my, my extra knowledge of the language to shape it up. So yeah, we could potentially do something like that with Sanskrit, but when do you really need to urgently read some bit of Buddhist Sanskrit? I mean, that's the use case where I don't understand the need for doing it so quickly.
Thanks very much.
So I have another question, which is, how will this, once maybe not the translation bit, but once the dictionary has, I don't know what your threshold of entries is or what your timeline for that is, but how will this support students of Buddhist Sanskrit in the future? I mean, I think I have some ideas about that based on everything you said, but maybe you could, highlight the ways in which this will be most effective.
So I'm not totally sure about students because we didn't initially create it for students. But I can tell you about translation. Yeah. So I think the resource as it is now sets out to ask, I think, mainly two questions. So one is, how do near synonym differentiate? So are they interchangeable? Do I need to translate them in the same way? How do I decide how to translate them? Are they the same or not? That's the first question. The second question is about polysemy. Now, one of the things, and this is also potentially very good for students. So one of the things that usually confuses students, apart from the difficulty of parsing a string of a million items in a compound, the other thing is how to decide which meaning applies out of a million meanings listed, especially in the Ivor Monia-Williams dictionary. So that is a very difficult task because the student doesn't really know, doesn't have enough experience to determine what is more likely to be the meaning. So, and also I think students, but I would say in general, people are puzzled by just how many different senses are there. So how is it possible this thing means, now I don't remember, but there are some that are really crazy, like it can mean the moon or a chair or an elephant. They say, why? I mean, there is no connection, or at least no visible connection that is rendered in Monia-Williams, but that's the problem with the dictionary, not with the language. So what we want to do is to show the continuity of the senses so that people can understand, oh, okay, so it has all these different semantic applications, but actually there is a core meaning out of which all these different senses originate. So obviously it's not always as neat as that, but for example, one that I personally liked is Sanketa. So if we look at Sanketa, it's not an extremely polysemic word, but it has a lot of application in Buddhist discourse on language. So language is conventional, etc. But that is also mean a meeting place. And it also means a juncture, especially of dharmas in a chain of dharmas. So how does this come about? And then it's this idea that, okay, there is consensus as is the main point. And then from consensus, you can have a mark or a sign, you can have a designation or a name, a convention, or an agreement and a promise. And then, of course, from the agreement, you agree on a meeting place and so on. So this is something that, that I think is going to help people just in a way to have a more holistic approach to the meaning of words rather than just seeing them as very disparate instantiation. Will, do you have a hand up?
Oh, I think.
Well, I do have an observation. I mean, the great thing about the way in which this visual layout works is that it really does give an immediate insight into the various nuances of a particular word. And earlier on, I was working with somebody from 84,000 on trying to extract a nuance from a Tibetan phrase based upon the parallels in the Chinese. And of course, having sort of tools which come up with alternative, non-apparent usages of words is very, very useful. So I like that. It's really great, pulling nuance out of words.
Thank you.
One thing I would also like to ask is one of the other issues as well is when working strictly with a Buddhist corpus, very often Buddhist scholars overlook other cultural factors that may come into the creation of the original text, but which tradition is no longer aware of. Are there any hints and sort of tips that you might be able to give us as to how we could use the broader corpus that you're working with to try and identify how non-obvious influences may come into the formation of an idea.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not sure about the non-obvious aspect of it, but I am sure about the non-traditional aspect of it. So I think one of the problems that sometimes people face when translating or just reading the Buddhist text is this over terminologization of the text. So this idea that everything has an incredibly specific doctrinal meaning. And that's, in some cases is true, but in many cases is not really there. And then the text is much easier to comprehend if one takes a step back and just think, okay, this thing just means, something really very trivial and common, everyday life. And the way to spot that, one of the way to spot it is to compare it with non-Buddhist material. So then you can really see how the word has a much wider application and how the Buddhist application is not that different. It's just that actually it's a subset of this possible lexical scenario where they really get specialized. And I think part of the issue is that many Buddhist scholars work from translations. So they work from Tibetan, they work from Chinese. Now, I think Chinese is a bit more versatile in the translation, but many of the Tibetan translations are so rigid that really it's difficult to see what is the general language application of the word because it's so far removed from the general Tibetan language. So I hope, for example, that this new project with the word embeddings will help a little bit with that and in highlighting continuity with the non-Buddhist literature. But yeah, we'll see.
Super, thank you.
Yeah, a somewhat related question is, maybe you could say a little bit more about the kind of meta categories for the different kinds of textual. So to distinguish the use in one commentarial tradition from a different genre. So it might look very different in sutra than it does in a very kind of specialized, shastric context and sort of, and you said a little bit about that, but maybe you could expand on how that works together with this programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually a big, let's say, problem or a bit open question is how to categorize the text. And my ultimate ideal is to have a very fluid categorization so that we are open to let the data really recategorize itself, clustering in its own ways rather than us superimposing our grid. However, both approaches obviously have some benefits. So obviously we do have some preconceptions, some ideas about how these texts relate to each other, etc. So we have come up with some metadata. For example, for understanding how in a textual tradition things develop, for example, we have one, I think is the only one where we have enough data to really do this kind of analysis, is the Prajnaparamita. So then we have a label that is Prajnaparamita is a discourse. And then we can do anything from the beginning, from the Ratnagurya Sanchayagata up to the Saratama, and see really how the discourse explodes, basically. The same words are recycled, but the context becomes so different that they are completely different things. So that's, but that's fairly easy to do because the texts themselves tell you they are Prajnaparamita texts. So you don't really need to do much subjective, interpretation. You just say, okay, I trust the tradition, I go for that. There are other cases where it's really much more complicated. So, for example, how would you categorize the Bodhisattva Bhumi? Is it an Abhidharma text? Is it a Yogacara text? You can play it whichever way you want, right? And also, obviously, it's very debatable whether Bodhisattva Bhumi is one text or whether you should treat each paragraph or sentence as its own unit. So basically, the ultimate goal, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, and it's not going to happen within this new NHS project because it's just 2 years, but the long-term vision is that then we will have tools powerful enough to really help us with a continuous window kind of comparison so that we can compare any bits of text with each other and then come up with some kind of grouping.
Yeah, and a related question is how these 250 texts, which you processed, sort of what is the category, again, categories are difficult, but sort of the breakdown of those and how do they relate, since it's such a just a fragment of the original literature. How do you think, like, what is missing from that? What, I mean, you don't know for sure, but anyways,
so,
to the best of your ability.
So, okay, I don't have any new analysis. So this is a little bit old. So this was 2 years ago, I think, the status of the corpus 2 years ago. So we had the corporal composition. So this, the Buddhist at that time was was a larger corpus than the reference corpus. No, now this is probably the reverse. Here for the Buddhist corpus, we had, so basically, we have 3 main buckets for periodization, but this is going to change because we know that this is not ideal. So it's going to change and all suggestions are welcome. But at the moment we have these 3 buckets, which is foundational, which is more or less up to the 4th century, classical that is 4th to 6th, and then we have commentarial for all the rest. And those are the the periods that we had at that time. And then we had a problem because we had a problem because the reference corpus didn't really align very well. So they had a lot of text was in the epics. So basically the epics was saturating of the reference corpus, which was a bit problematic. And this is probably still quite through the Buddhist Sutra, Buddhist Shastra, and the rest of Buddhist literature is more or less like this. Now, one important thing, and I'm not sure, Karin, this is where you were getting at or not, but for dictionary and for research in general, people usually tend to balance the corpus, right? So they want to have equal amount of each type of text that they use. And we are not doing it. So the reason why we are not doing it is because there is so little text that we don't want to just chop it. However, because of the metadata are encoded at text level, it's possible to balance it. So a user can easily balance the corpus if they so wish.
Yeah, I guess my other question was just what genres seem to be missing most from just what is available in, in the Sanskrit in terms of what's surviving. Is there kind of some hole where you think, oh, this must be maybe skewing our...
Yeah, well, obviously, one thing I know for sure skews no, we are aware of it, so it doesn't really skew it, but it's something I'm always very, very aware of. Is 2 texts. So for the classical period, the Abhidharma Kosha somehow dominates the analysis all the time. And then for the foundational period, we have a problem with the Shata Sahasrika, which you can imagine is exactly what it is the Shata Sahasrika. So is the biggest element in the corpus. So obviously it does skew the analysis a little bit. Now, obviously it would be great to have more to have more possibly non-religious text with the Buddhist theme. So we have some, but the thing is, my understanding is not much has been preserved. So there was quite a bit of dramatic pieces, but they are not preserved. So we tried working with the fragments, but it was so messy, it was just impossible. Other things that we should get more of is dharanis and stotras. But then I don't know, I didn't mention it, how we built this corpus. So basically we have processed every single bit of digitized Sanskrit available. And the digitized Sanskrit available is not comprehensive. So there is a lot of editions that have not been digitized. So those are still, to be procured, but that I guess is for another project because digitization is really not within the scope of our work.
And then how do you see this at some point, or do you see it, relating to, text preserved in other, Indic languages, which will have a lot of, overlap, but maybe some interesting differences in how they're using some of the terms.
Yeah. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, obviously, we already have something like the Mahavastu, which, by the way, didn't process very well, so I'm sure it's full of errors. But we do have the Mahavastu. So from the Mahavastu to then go to Pali, it's not that big of a jump. So we could, in theory, just take the Pali corpus as well. And yeah, actually, we should do it. Probably is also being processed already, so it could be a fairly easy addition. So yeah, many things are possible. Gandhari text, definitely we could. I mean, Gandhari again is many times it's just, you know, you put a U at the end, you got a Gandhari text. So we could include it, definitely.
Great. And I'm wondering if anyone from the audience has any more questions for Ligeia.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Ligeia. Thank you for the talk. So I think I have a question about lexicography in general. You mentioned that different lexicographers segment the words differently and then they spell the word differently. How is that problem solved? You know, like how does the community come to a consensus as this is the word we're going to use? And
yeah. You refer to the verbs that we were discussing the other day. So I don't really know how it works. So I think for lexicography in general, there is usually, you know, for living languages, there is usually an academy or a body that is in charge of the official language. So they are responsible for this kind of decisions for their own language. Now, when we come to historical languages, I'm not totally sure. I mean, surely there is a consensus that forms just for the practice in the field. However, in Sanskrit, for example, there are some differences. Like I think mostly everybody lemmatized the nouns to the nomen to the a stem form. However, when it comes to verb, some dictionaries go for the root and some dictionary go for the inflected form at the third person singular, because I think mainly for the didactical purposes. I don't know if maybe Kari knows more about it, but I think it's for didactical purposes because it's a bit easier for the student to understand the verbal form, to search for the inflected third person singular rather than searching for the root, which may be very, very different from the conjugated form. But then I don't know if there is a consensus there, and therefore I was puzzled myself, like, I don't know how is lemmatized in BabbleNet, if they are using the roots or not. I don't know.
So there's certain common practices that are taking place, but there's no like presiding organ, like central body that, you know, sets the rules that this is how things
no, as far as I know, for historical languages there isn't. And also sometimes there is also, you can see a difference in, you know, generational difference. So at some point maybe it was the consensus was in a way and then it changed. But really I am not I'm not sure. Kari, do you know more about this? Or
I don't know what the logic is. I just remember that, you know, I tried to look up by the root when I was studying, because I felt it was important to always identify the root.
yeah.
But there's a question here from John, who says, how are you dealing with Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit?
Yeah, so I imagine you mean in the processing of the corpus, not in the dictionary. So basically in the dictionary, we are dealing with it in the sense that we are not normalizing it. So we are taking the spelling as it is in the digitized edition that we have. And we don't do any further processing of it. And then, okay, so this in the dictionary, one problem comes up sometimes when a form is attested both in masculine and in feminine. So the question then arises, should we have two lemmatas, one is feminine and one is masculine, or shall we have one lemma? And this also answered the question that nobody has asked in this audience, but that usually people ask, why don't I put the syntactic and the gender specification in the dictionary? So if you look up in my dictionary, there is nothing tells you that is a noun, and even less tells you if it is a feminine or neuter noun. Reason for that is that these things are really fluid. So I don't feel that is improving anybody's life to know that this noun is supposedly masculine, but it inflects in the Buddhist text as feminine. So really, it just confuses the analysis, I think. So the problem when we have a noun, and we had this with, I think it was kalpana and kalpana, and we were a bit surprised, like, okay, do we need two lemmas or one? So in the end, it's a semantic test. If it has the same meaning, we decide that it's the same word. If it seems to have different meanings consistently, then we have two lemmas.
And are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, Sanjoy.
Hi, it's a very mind-blowing presentation. So thank you very much. It is my curiosity, like earlier that when the scholars compiled the text, like 7th century and 6th century or up to 11th century in India, so they did not follow exactly the grammatical structure. So they just follow the rhyming words, you know, that as you mentioned, like the kalpana, kalpani, you know, so we just see that, you know, same meaning, you know. So then the text, you know, that India lost the tradition, then Buddhist text, Sanskrit text arrived to Tibet, and Tibet they translate into the Tibetan language. And later on, 14th, 15th, 16th century, from Tibetan text, classical Tibetan, again, they translate into the Sanskrit, Sanskrit too. So do you see any difference between the earlier compilation and the later on compilation of this text, you know?
I will let you know. At the moment, we have too little late material for me to be able to answer that question. So I don't know yet. But probably, my expectation is yes, but I can't say yet.
So, well, so if there is no, I mean, I listened a few years ago, one of the paper from Aruna Gomez, I think you know, he said that Sanskrit, the early, I mean, that this Buddhist Sanskrit still needs some addition. So
still needs addition.
Still an addition for grammatical correction.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, some texts are being corrected while edited. That again, it's a matter, I think, of practice in the field. I think now is become more common to also have a diplomatic edition that doesn't add the corrections. So personally, but it happens very rarely, but in a couple of texts, we had the choice between having the edited version with, you know, basically standardized, or the diplomatic edition. And even though the edited version would be much easier to process, we always go for the diplomatic edition because obviously that's the actual text that we've got. So it's already very difficult to do any kind of you know, dating based on the morphology or the spelling remain, because obviously it all depends on the manuscript and not really on the text. But I think that adding the layer of just rewriting the text because you think that the noun should be masculine or the genitive should have a certain morphology, I find it a little bit extreme.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions right now. So maybe everyone, I'll give a few minutes if anyone wants to ask more, but I will ask Ligeia, is there something else about this project which you feel you want to say a little bit more about, or do you feel?
Oh gosh, well, what should I say more? Well, one thing that I could say more is that this model can be used for other languages, and therefore I think that's fairly important, because many people working with low resource languages don't have the resources really to just create an online dictionary from scratch. So I think it's very important to just say that, you know, achieving this has been a little bit complicated at the beginning, but now we have a pipeline and it has become relatively easy to just derive any dictionary from a corpus, so that people working with other languages or maybe working with another variety of Sanskrit they could use our pipeline and have their own dictionary made fairly easily.
And I guess I have one. Oh, wait, there is a question in the chat. And then I have one final question. So Daniel asks, what computer language did you build this in?
This one, surprise, surprise, is built entirely in R. And this is something that I would encourage anybody to do. Just use R and the Shiny infrastructure, the Shiny framework is incredible. So I really recommend anybody to use it. I also, when I say that I am thinking of creating a desktop application so that people could use it and with their own data, etc. So that I think is going to be an Electron app.
Yeah, and then there's a comment here from Sanjoy that Bengali language is close to Sanskrit. Yeah, so that it could be useful for Bengali,
Yeah.
And so my question was just a little bit about the kind of course, all of this is dependent on funding and having the, the people working with you, but kind of what do you see as sort of the possible timeline, given different amounts of those resources,
Okay, so
for different pieces of, the project, like what seems most doable, or if you had such and such, what could you get,
Yeah. So I think it's basically, it's not linear. So it's not that easy. So whenever I write a grant application, one of my biggest headache is to provide a sensible timeline, because I know myself that actually is going to change, because the moment we have the resources, then it's going to really speed up. So it's a bit difficult to predict, but I think that if we get if the word sense discrimination and synonym detection is going to work well, it's really going to speed up our work immensely. I would hope, no, not only hope, let's say I intend to cover the entire Sanskrit, Buddhist Sanskrit lexicon in, let's say, in the next 5 years. Obviously, most of it will be done just automatically, because we don't have the resources to go through all lemmatas and analyze it. But I think an automated draft for the entire Sanskrit lexicon is achievable in 5 years' time. And then during that period also, we could create a lexical portraits or deeper analysis for a substantial amount of lemmatas. I'm not totally sure how many. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and answering our questions. And thank you everyone for attending. And we'll sign off for now. And there's lots of thanks coming through the chat.
Thank you.
All right, great.
So, and please feel free to email me if you have some questions later on.
Yeah, and maybe I'll put that. Well, you can find Ligeia through the Mangalam Research Center, Buddhist Translators Workbench.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.